And welcome to Washington Unplugged and another edition of Flashpoints with my friend Juan Zarate. Juan, thanks for joining us as always.
Bob, great to see you.
We've talked a lot about Libya. That's been kind of the center stage, ground zero, if you will, in the uprising in the Islamic and Arab world. But we haven't spent a lot of time on Syria, and that's a key spot. What's going on there?
Well, Syria, what you have emerging, I think, is a vicious cycle of protests, violence from the regime, growing protests, attempts by the regime to ameliorate the protesters. For example, the Assad regime pulling back and rescinding the emergency law, which has been in place for 40 years. And really, the regime, I think, is feeling more and more under assault by the protesters, and they're using more and more violence. And this, I think, is presenting a crisis moment for the region, because Syria, even though Libya is a big deal, Syria is a bigger deal, given where it sits geopolitically, its importance with respect to Israel, Lebanon as a linchpin proxy ally for Iran, the center of terrorist organizations that have offices in Damascus like Hamas, Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. So Syria is a key player geopolitically in the region, much more so than Libya. And so the unrest there could roil the region. And I think importantly too, Bob, this presents real challenges for the U.S. administration. We've set forth some policies with respect to Libya and the region. First of all, calling regimes illegitimate at a point where it appears that their population doesn't want the leadership anymore. Secondly, with respect to humanitarian intervention, the duty to protect principle, which is applied internationally. And then finally, really reacting to media attention to issues and atrocities which are occurring. And I think one of the issues here with Syria is, at what point do we reach the point of illegitimacy in terms of the Assad regime? At what point is there a duty to protect the population, which appears to be under attack in various ways within Syria? And given the dearth of media attention, will there be more media attention which will build momentum for some type of intervention, military or otherwise? And at this point, I don't think anyone's thinking about a military intervention. The question is, can you do more to help and protect the protesters and also then pressure the regime?
But if the administration comes out and tries to pressure Assad, I mean, we really don't have a very big hammer here. So don't we run the risk, or doesn't the administration run the risk of just being totally snubbed and rebuffed, and then they lose a little standing even more?
Well, I think that's a challenge. I think that there's also a challenge of inaction, and that is to say, here's a regime that's pretty much an enemy of the United States, allied with Iran, helped foreign fighters go into Iraq to kill U.S. troops, a base of terrorist organizations that we've listed as terrorist organizations, and a force of instability from our perspective in Lebanon. So, inaction in this context also breeds a sense of, lack of will and weakness on the part of the U.S. And so the question is, what can be done? So I think there are a few things that can be done. It's not all about military action. I think we have to remember that there's moral and political and diplomatic pressure that can be put on the regime. Here are a couple of examples. One, why not issue a statement and engage in an effort where we're looking for all of the corrupt assets for the Assad regime? We've already put out the names of folks like Rami Makhlouf, designated as a corrupt insider for the Syrian regime. Why not do what we've done in the Mubarak and the Gaddafi context? Go after their assets, go after the family's assets, and say, look, they aren't legitimate. So that's one area of pressure. Secondly, a human rights campaign. I mean, this is a human rights issue first and foremost. Where are the human rights groups? Why isn't the U.S. asking for UN special rapporteur, as we did with Iran? More attention to the human rights element. And I think you can do that by convening meetings here in Washington, asking Nordic countries, which are often very interested in human rights issues, to deal with these issues. And then finally, there's some diplomatic steps. We still have an ambassador there. Pulling back the ambassadors, doing things symbolically to demonstrate that we not only morally abhor what's happening, but have questions about the legitimacy of the regime. And I think there's a whole suite of things that can be done absent military intervention that would help the dissidents and the Democrats and the protesters and put real pressure on the Assad regime, and thereby put pressure on their allies, the Iranians.
It's a very tough one, though, because the U.S. can say Assad is illegitimate, and he can say, what are you going to do about it? And that's really calling on our bluff.
No, that's right. But that's where you go all out publicly and say, this is what we're going to do about it. We're going to help the dissidents and Democrats. We're going to help break firewalls of information. We're going to try to get information in and out. We're going to get a human rights campaign underway. We're going to freeze your assets. We're going to go after your family's assets. We're going to go after corruption. There's a whole suite of things to say, look, we now consider you illegitimate, and so we're going to push you out. I think a bigger question, too, Bob, is what follows the Assad regime, because Syria is not a homogenous country the way that Egypt is, for example. And so there is a question of who follows Assad, an Alawite regime. It would likely be some sort of coalition, but you do have questions as to what follows a regime like that in a volatile region.
Heavy Iranian influence.
Exactly. And so there are big questions.
Okay, let's move on to Iraq. I mean, there's been a lot of attention again on Afghanistan with the troop withdrawal deadline starting to kick in this summer, presumably. What about Iraq, though? This is a war that's really winding down. Are we really going to get out? Do people there want us out?
Well, we have 50,000 troops left in Iraq, and in many ways the troops are engaged continuously in training, in support missions for their Iraqi counterparts. But what's interesting about Iraq is there's a growing debate about whether or not the U.S. should be asked to stay in some form. Up to 20,000 troops has been mentioned in this debate. What's interesting here is as we move toward the point of U.S. withdrawal, you see tensions growing within Iraq itself, because the United States has served in many ways as a stabilizing force. People would find that interesting, but it has been U.S. troops have been a bit of the glue between some of the factional groups within Iraq. So within Iraq now you're seeing some more attacks. We had attacks in the Green Zone. You've seen more tensions in the north, in Kurdistan, between the Kurds and the Arabs. You've seen some challenges, for example, the Iraqi government going after the Iranian dissident terrorist group, the MEK, their camp at Camp Ashraf. So a lot of things are kind of popping up as areas of conflict. And that has emerged to debate where Secretary Gates himself has said, look, we're willing to negotiate further troop commitments beyond the point where we say we'd withdraw, but it's up to the Iraqis to ask us. And so the real question is, will the Iraqis ask? I think it's very difficult politically for Prime Minister Maliki to do that. You have folks like Sadr saying, if the Americans stay beyond when they said they were going to stay, we're going to rearm and fight them. At the same time, you've got the Kurds in the north saying, please don't go, because America, you have been the glue here, and conflict is likely to rise over things like status of some of the cities, as well as status of oil rights and revenue, et cetera. So this is a delicate period with Iraq, and I think we would be really foolish to take our eye off the ball of this transition period in Iraq, especially at the moment of the Arab Spring, where Iraq is a democracy, flawed, factionalized, developing democracy. And so in some ways they're ahead of the game in terms of the Arab Spring. And so I think it's really important and interesting to monitor this and to watch to see how the Iraqis respond.
And of course the rest of the Arab world is watching to see what we do too.
That's exactly right.
This is not in a vacuum.
This is not in a vacuum, and the U.S. has interests here. I mean, there's an interest in making sure that Iraq doesn't unravel, that there isn't sectarian conflict that arises. There's interest in seeing that al-Qaeda doesn't gain momentum in Iraq, al-Qaeda in Iraq there. There's also a sense of, we need a bit of counterweight to Iran, that Iraq itself on its own may not be able to be a counterforce to Iran in the long term. And so those are all U.S. interests to have a presence perhaps beyond the deadline. Politically for the United States, that's difficult. President Obama has committed to this. He's made a pledge to get our troops out, and given budget pressures, it's probably likely he's not going to back down from that. You
mentioned al-Qaeda, so that gets us to our third topic, and you wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times, very interesting, about al-Qaeda regaining its voice. So this has been a force that's been kind of on the sidelines as this Arab Spring is played out. Your observations were interesting. What were they?
Thank you, Bob. I think we took a lot of comfort in the initial silence from al-Qaeda leadership. There were a lot of us in the field saying it's interesting that al-Qaeda is sort of probably back on its heels, trying to figure out what's happening with the Arab Spring. And I think we took some comfort in that. I think what's happening now, though, is al-Qaeda's gone on a narrative offensive. You've seen 5 statements now from Ayman al-Zawahiri, al-Qaeda's #2. You've seen Anwar al-Awlaki publish an essay on the Arab Spring and the opportunities for al-Qaeda. You've seen other groups like al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb talk about the Arab Spring as part of their own mission, et cetera. And really what I think is at play here is al-Qaeda sees this as a strategic moment. They could either fall into the dustbin of history and prove completely irrelevant in the Arab world, the heart of their constituency, in the Sunni Arab world. Or this could be a moment where they not only get breathing space to operate again, but also gain ideological relevance again, at a time when, at the eve of the Arab Spring, they really were proving less and less relevant. And so I think what al-Qaeda is doing, and you see this in their statements, they're banking on the long-term disillusionment of the Arab Spring. They're contending that really what you've done to topple the dictator has been very good, but it's not going to be enough. And just wait and see. The West will co-opt what's happening. They're going to be the puppeteers behind the scenes. And what you think is freedom and liberty and reform is not going to be real. And what will really get you there is what we've been saying all along as al-Qaeda. That is Sharia, use of jihad, and ultimately an Islamic State. That is real freedom. That's real reform. And so that message right now doesn't resonate with the folks who've gone to the streets and the protesters. They've been secular, modern, young, largely not focused on the U.S., focused on local issues. All that is to our benefit with respect to al-Qaeda. But I think the challenge for us is, as the Arab Spring evolves, as disillusionment emerges, as people grow discontent, does al-Qaeda pick off people, pick off elements of the movement, pick off perhaps and use the not only operational breathing space but political breathing space to regain ideological legitimacy? I think that's something that they're going to work toward. I think it's something that they're going to be shaping with their narratives, and we'll see more statements to this effect. And I think it's something we need to be conscious of, and frankly, we need to counter.
What's really interesting here is how al-Qaeda views time. They're very patient. It's been a hallmark of al-Qaeda. And here again we see it. We'll let this revolution play out. We'll see that the next generation fails, and you'll come back to us. They're very patient, while we, on the other hand, are looking for immediately what's next, what's next.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, Bob, and it's a very interesting contrast in the context of how we view the war on terror or the ideological battles at play, because al-Qaeda really does take kind of a millennial view. I mean, they're thinking centuries ahead. We're thinking 2-year election cycles,
right.
or even 24/7 media cycles, right? So we have to keep that in mind. That said, one of the challenges for al-Qaeda in this environment is people are affected by and reacting to that immediate environment. And so the environment may outpace al-Qaeda at a certain point. They may grow irrelevant if their message doesn't gain traction, if they're not able to prove results. And I think that's what we were starting to see on the eve of the Arab Spring, really, al-Qaeda proving to be irrelevant to people's lives, at least in the Arab world. And so the speed of all of this is very interesting, but I think you're absolutely right. We have to keep in mind al-Qaeda is thinking decades, centuries ahead, while we think in short cycles.
And finally, let's talk a little bit about the elections in Nigeria. You're making some observations before we went on the air here. Very interesting what's happening there.
Well, Nigeria is an incredibly important country, the most populous country in Africa, a real political and economic power in West Africa, no doubt, if not the whole of the continent. They just had an election, and Goodluck Jonathan, who was the sitting president, has been elected. What's interesting about the election is that it has been viewed as fairly fair, open, transparent. A lot of reforms post the 2007 election, which was fraudulent and fraught with all sorts of problems, really came into play and worked. A lot of the reforms worked. And so people are looking at this and saying, look, this is a good moment for Nigeria because it's proven that it can be a legitimate democracy, that this can be a step forward in its political evolution. And this is a moment for Nigeria to not only put its own political house in order, but to really set the stage for Nigeria being a power in the region and in Africa. You've seen in the past where they've been a real driver in the West African security issues. But the question is, can Nigeria be an economic, political, and social power in the region? It's not all roses and candies, though, here, because you have divides within Nigerian society that have been exacerbated over the last 2 decades. One is the Muslim-Christian divide. The Muslim North has seen a number of riots after the election, feeling disenfranchised a bit from the results. You have an economic stratification, which is unhealthy. Oligarchs having access to oil revenue, for example, having access that others don't, and most of the population being outside of the formal financial system. That's not good. And you have tribal divisions, which are part of the dynamics, not to mention all the politics going on. All that said, I think this election is very healthy because it shows that they have a multi-party system. They have healthy elections. They're about to have elections for their governors in 36 states. This is a thriving democracy, though flawed still, in a fractious country. But if they're able to get their political house in order and able to be a real power in the region, they can be a force for good in the continent and I think for the rest of the world. And I think stability in Nigeria is good for the United States. It's good for the entirety of the world.
I was going to say, if you could get stability there, just the fact of having a nice stable spot
Yep.
on the African continent would be huge.
Yeah, and a country that can not only handle its own problems, can not only deal with its own resources and be a responsible party, but could then be a leader on other regional and continent-wide issues that are of concern, and can drive things like military intervention if need be for humanitarian purposes, or political solutions to problems that may emerge. That's really needed and would be important for Nigeria.
We've been trying to end flashpoints on an up note, and I think successfully today you did that.
There we go. Thank you, Bob.
All right, our national security consultant, Juan Zarate. Thanks as always.
Thank you, Bob.
And we'll see you next time on Flashpoints. Thanks for joining us.